It was a tense and humid morning in Washington, D.C. in May 2025, one that would mark the beginning of what historians would later describe as the most catastrophic miscalculation of Donald Trump's political career, now deep into his second term as President of the United States. Trump's temper had grown increasingly volatile. His frustrations were boiling over, and the subject of his rage that morning was not China, Russia, or even the Democrats. It was a young African leader, President IBRAHIM Traoré of Burkina Faso. "This African kid is causing too much trouble," Trump growled, slamming his fist onto the polished mahogany table in the Oval Office. The room fell silent. The walls, heavy with the weight of presidential portraits and history, almost seemed to recoil at the outburst. "First, he kicks out our agents. Now look, other African nations are following his lead. If we don't crush this movement, we're going to lose our grip on the entire continent." The inner circle around Trump, some loyal, some fearful, some simply opportunistic, exchanged cautious glances. One man, however, leaned forward with a smirk. Steve Bannon, recently reinstated as a strategic advisor, leaned into the chaos with his signature brand of aggressive politics. "Mr. President," Bannon said, eyes glinting, "why not invite him to a live interview? Fox News, prime time. Show the world who's really boss. Let's drag him into our arena. Make it our rules, our game." Trump's demeanor changed instantly. He straightened up, smiled wickedly, and snapped his fingers. "Brilliant," he said. "I'm going to humiliate him on national television. I'll expose him as just another little African dictator pretending to play with the big boys. America does not get pushed around by peasants in fatigues." Without delay, the White House placed the call. Thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, President IBRAHIM Traoré sat behind a modest but dignified desk carved from local wood. His aides watched curiously as he took the call on speaker. "IBRAHIM, my young friend," Trump began, dripping with false warmth. "How about we clear up some misunderstandings between our countries? A live conversation. Fox News, you and me. Honest talk between leaders." Traoré smiled calmly, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. What Trump didn't know was that IBRAHIM had already predicted this move and was recording the entire call. "Of course, Mr. President," Traoré said smoothly. "It will be enlightening to discuss U.S.-Africa relations in a public forum." After hanging up, Traoré turned to his national security advisor, Dr. Ouedraogo. "Trump has just walked into the perfect trap," he said, almost whispering. "Begin preparing everything, every file, every recording, every document we've been gathering." "Sir, are you sure?" the minister asked, visibly uneasy. "Exposing these files could ignite a diplomatic inferno." "The inferno has already begun," Traoré said, his voice steady. "He has declared a silent war on African sovereignty. It's time he learns that consequences aren't reserved for the weak." In the days leading up to the highly anticipated interview, the atmosphere in both Washington and Ouagadougou grew electric. Trump, believing he would outmaneuver a so-called inexperienced African soldier-turned-president, was obsessed with crafting his lines and traps. "We'll hit him on terrorism, poverty, and the coup," he barked to his team, pointing at briefing documents. "We'll paint him as a radical militant in a failed state." Stephen Miller, cold and calculating as ever, suggested, "Why not question his very legitimacy? Imply that Africa doesn't produce real leaders, just rebels with lucky timing." Trump laughed loudly. "Perfect. I'll make it clear that only America decides who gets to sit at the adult table." Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré's war room was a hive of strategic activity. Major Sawadogo, head of intelligence, entered with a thick file. "Mr. President, we now have transcripts of 47 phone calls in which Trump uses deeply racist and derogatory language about African leaders, including a December call where he described them all as monkeys in suits. Include that, Traoré said without emotion. What about U.S. destabilization efforts? We have detailed proof that Trump personally authorized over $340 million for covert operations meant to destabilize governments refusing U.S. influence, Dr. Ouedraogo confirmed. Traoré's expression hardened. He has stolen from us, insulted us, tried to break us. But now the world will hear our side. At Fox News headquarters in New York, host Sean Hannity was giddy with anticipation. This will be the takedown of the year, he told producers. Trump will steamroll this African kid. It'll be fantastic television. No one in that studio had the slightest clue that they were about to broadcast the most devastating political backfire in modern history. May 29, 2025, arrived with the electric tension of a global boxing match. In the Fox News studio, Trump adjusted, his red tie with swagger, rehearsing his opening zingers. His team buzzed around him with misplaced confidence. But halfway across the world, in the quiet calm of the presidential office in Ouagadougou, IBRAHIM Traoré sat silently. Dressed simply, he carried no notes, no teleprompter, just a briefcase. Inside it were the truths the world had long ignored, truths that were about to bring a superpower to its knees. And as the countdown to the broadcast began, two presidents, prepared to speak, not as equals, but as a test of what kind of leadership the world would remember. One built on ego and domination, or one forged in dignity, truth, and fire. "Good evening, America," announced Sean Hannity, his voice sharp with anticipation. "Tonight, we witness an unprecedented and historic confrontation. President Donald J. Trump versus President IBRAHIM Traoré on the future of U.S.-Africa relations." The screen split into two contrasting visuals. On the left, Trump sat confidently in a luxurious Fox News studio, the stars and stripes behind him, radiating power and familiarity. On the right, President Traoré appeared in a modest but dignified presidential office in Ouagadougou, surrounded by national symbols, his posture calm, his gaze unshaken. Hannity turned to Trump first. "Mr. President," he began, "millions of Americans are watching tonight. Many are asking, how do you plan to confront the rising wave of African leaders who are boldly questioning America's global authority?" Trump leaned forward, his jaw clenched, eyes gleaming with defiance. "Sean," he said, "it's simple. America first means we don't tolerate disrespect from anyone, especially not from countries that survive off our aid. These nations should be thanking us, not challenging us." Then, with a cruel smile, he turned to the camera and said, "IBRAHIM, listen closely. America sets the rules of the global order. Countries like yours, they exist because we allow them to." President Traoré didn't flinch. He remained composed, his voice low but cutting. "That's an interesting perspective, Mr. President," he replied. "But perhaps we should take this opportunity to talk about what you truly think of African leaders when you believe no one is listening." Trump's confident smirk faltered for the first time. "What are you talking about?" he asked, a flicker of unease flashing across his face. "I'm talking," said Traoré evenly, "about a private call you made last December to the President of France, where you referred to African presidents as, and I quote, monkeys in tea, suits who need to be disciplined." The studio fell into a deafening silence. Trump's face went pale. He fumbled his words. That's a lie. Fabricated nonsense." "Is it?" IBRAHIM asked calmly, a faint knowing smile forming. "Hannity, would your producers care to play the recording I've submitted? Or should I?" Trump's eyes widened in panic. He suddenly knew exactly which conversation IBRAHIM was referring to. Hannity shifted uncomfortably, sensing the situation spiraling beyond his control. "President Traoré," he stammered, "those are extremely serious accusations." "These are not accusations," IBRAHIM replied coldly. They are verified recordings, documented facts. So, Mr. Trump, shall we play the audio now, or would you prefer to explain yourself first? Trump was now visibly sweating, hands twitching, his signature composure unraveling. Ibrahim, you don't understand the context. I understand. Perfectly, Ibrahim interrupted, pressing a small button. This is the recording from December 15th, 2024 at 2:23 p.m., a call between President Trump and President Macron. Trump's unmistakable voice blared through the studio. Emmanuel, these Africans are getting too arrogant, especially this kid from Burkina Faso. They're all monkeys in suits pretending they matter. We need to show them who runs the world. Gasps echoed off the studio walls. Hannity looked horrified. Trump tried to interject. That was taken out of context. Out of context? Ibrahim asked, his expression hardening. Please, Mr. Trump, tell us, what context justifies this kind of racist and colonial rhetoric about democratically elected leaders? The recording continued, now more vicious. Frankly, all of Africa needs to be recolonized. These places are nothing more than zoos run by animals. Hannity reached for the console. We need to go to a break. There will be no break, Ibrahim said firmly. The world deserves to hear the truth, and we are not done. He played another clip. This next one, Ibrahim explained, is from a private call with President Putin, where President Trump discusses, in his own words, a final solution to the African problem. Trump jumped from his seat, his voice rising into panic. No, turn that off. That's fake. Deep fake trash. But it was too late. Trump's voice again filled the airwaves. Vladimir, we need to work together to keep these Africans in check. Maybe some coordinated operations. Quiet, efficient. They're getting too bold. Trump was now in full meltdown, his hands trembling, his face flushed. This is an intelligence coup, a setup, a conspiracy to destroy me, to destroy America. Still seated and calm, Ibrahim responded, These recordings have been independently verified by 3 separate global intelligence agencies, including the FBI. The voice print analysis confirms their authenticity. He looked directly into the camera and concluded, You've just proven to the world that your Africa policy is not rooted in American interests, but in white supremacist ideology, masked by geopolitical posturing. You see Africa not as a continent of sovereign nations, but as a threat to your outdated vision of global dominance. Trump could barely speak now. He looked like a man unraveling on live television, caught red-handed in the very rhetoric he once believed was secret. Let's go to commercial. Please, Hannity pleaded again, but Ibrahim cut him off. There will be no escape, he said coldly. We are not done. The world must know everything. He reached for one final recording. The studio remained frozen in stunned disbelief as Ibrahim Traoré dropped the final bombshell. Let's move on to your conversation with your top generals, he said, his voice unwavering. The one you had about Operation African Cleansing, a classified directive to eliminate African leaders you deemed problematic. Trump visibly jolted in his seat, his hands now trembling uncontrollably. That's not real, he gasped, eyes darting toward the crew as if someone could save him. But Ibrahim pressed on, cold and deliberate. I have the audio. Shall we play it for the world? Before anyone could protest, the studio speakers came alive again, delivering the unmistakable voice of Donald J. Trump. I need Ibrahim Traoré gone, permanently. Make it look like an accident. I want no traces. This needs to happen fast. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of what had just been heard hung in the air like a thundercloud. Trump was now gasping, his face ashen. Lies! He shouted, a vein bulging in his temple. All lies! Deep fakes! AI manipulation! This is a coup! Mr. President, Ibrahim said calmly, your own generals were so horrified by your orders that they recorded your meetings. 3 of them have already handed over classified materials to Congress. I have their testimonies here, as well as your signed directives. Ibrahim raised a set of documents, flashing them toward the cameras. The camera zoomed in for clarity. Donald Trump's unmistakable signature sat above a $500 million budget authorization. This, Mr. Trump, is your written order to neutralize African destabilizing elements. And here, he said, lifting another document, is the kill list. 23 African leaders democratically elected targeted for assassination. My name is at the top. Trump's composure shattered. He slumped back in his chair, barely able to hold himself upright. No, this can't be happening. None of this is real, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's very real, Ibrahim replied solemnly. Just like your words at a cabinet meeting on January 8th, would you like to hear what you said about Africans behind closed doors? Another recording began. Trump's voice, venomous and unfiltered, filled the room. These Africans are genetically inferior. Darwin was right. There is a natural racial hierarchy. America must dominate them or they'll overrun us. Gasps erupted in the Fox studio. Hannity clutched his earpiece, begging the producers to cut the feed, but they didn't. The gravity of what was unfolding had overtaken any sense of network control. President Trump, Ibrahim said, his tone now sharper, you have been exposed as a white supremacist who weaponized the highest office in the world to pursue genocide. How will you explain this to your people? To the world? Trump began to mumble incoherently, rocking slightly. No one was supposed to know. These were classified, secret plans, decades in the making. Then, to everyone's horror, he began to confess. Out loud. You don't understand the pressure, he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. America is losing its grip. These Africans, they're getting too powerful. China, Russia, it's an existential threat. Ibrahim watched, impassive, as Trump spiraled into psychological collapse live on television. So, just to clarify, Ibrahim said quietly, you are confirming that you authorized assassinations of African leaders? I had to protect America, Trump screamed. You were taking everything, our influence, our markets, our alliances. It was survival. Sean Hannity was pale, visibly shaking, his hands signaling frantically to the control room. Mr. President, maybe you should stop talking, but Trump wasn't listening. Operation Free Africa, he said, now nearly delirious. We had to remove all independent African leaders, recolonize through proxies, civil wars, coups, assassinations, whatever it takes. Africa should serve America, not compete with it. A stunned hush fell across the world. Trump had just confessed to a doctrine of racial dominance and imperial conquest on live television. Mr. President, Ibrahim said firmly, you have just confessed to planning genocide against the African continent. In front of 200 million viewers, Trump's face fell. His eyes were vacant. America first at no matter the cost, he whispered. At last, Hannity managed to cut the broadcast, but the damage was done. Within hours, shockwaves were tearing through the global political landscape. Every major outlet was looping clips of Trump's confession. The headlines were seismic. Trump confesses to African genocide plan. White supremacy in the White House exposed live. Operation African Cleansing, Trump's shocking confession at Talbot Mati. The White House, absolute chaos erupted. Vice President J.D. Vance summoned an emergency cabinet meeting, his voice grim and trembling. He had a mental breakdown on live TV, Vance said. He admitted to war crimes. The 25th Amendment must be invoked. The Secretary of Defense tried to salvage the situation. We need a denial strategy. Say it was a hallucination, stress, medication. But someone interrupted him. He didn't just ramble, another official said. He confessed, clearly, repeatedly, and in detail. This is beyond PR. This is a crisis of international legitimacy. Outside, protesters had already begun gathering. Across Africa, streets filled with people waving flags, shouting chants of freedom and unity. IBRAHIM Traoré's calm defiance had just shattered decades of hidden neocolonialism. And back in Washington, a once powerful president sat sobbing in a secure room, surrounded not by advisors, but federal agents preparing charges of genocide, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity. The world would never be the same again. The Secretary of State slammed his fist on the table, his voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "How do we deny recordings of his own voice?" he demanded, looking around the room filled with stunned officials. The silence was thick. No one had an answer. The recordings of Donald Trump openly admitting to orchestrating the assassinations of foreign leaders, including a genocidal operation targeting African presidents, were undeniable and had now gone viral across the globe. In the halls of Congress, chaos erupted. Speaker Nancy Pelosi immediately took the floor, her face pale but resolute. "We are not just dealing with political corruption," she declared. "This is treason, war crimes, and an attempted genocide." Donald Trump has confessed, on live television, to orchestrating mass political assassinations and targeting African leaders for extermination. We must act. The House Judiciary Committee convened within hours, and impeachment proceedings were formally initiated. For the first time in modern history, there was no political divide. Democrats and Republicans alike recognized the gravity of the situation. Even traditionally staunch Trump allies began to break ranks. Senator Mitt Romney, visibly shaken, stood before reporters. "I can no longer support nor defend a man who used the highest office in our land to conspire in the murder of foreign leaders. Planning genocide is not a matter of national security. It is a crime against all humanity." Around the world, the reaction was swift and uncompromising. In capitals from Berlin to Beijing, the mood was one of horror and righteous fury. The United Nations called an Emergency Security Council meeting, and the Secretary General issued a chilling statement. "We have seen echoes of this kind of evil before in history. Never again must not become an empty phrase. We must act." At The Hague, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court held a press conference that was broadcast live across dozens of nations. President Trump's televised confession constitutes prima facie evidence of genocidal intent, she said. "We are launching an immediate investigation into crimes against humanity and conspiracy to commit genocide. The international community cannot ignore what has just been revealed." China and Russia, usually locked in fierce rivalry with one another, issued an unprecedented joint condemnation. "We may differ politically," the statement read, "but on this we agree. The supremacist barbarity of the American regime, as exposed in President Trump's confession, is a threat to global civilization." Their joint resolution called for international sanctions and a tribunal. The European Union reacted just as fiercely. "We cannot and will not negotiate with a government whose leader has confessed to planning genocide," declared the president of the European Commission. All trade agreements with the United States were immediately suspended, and diplomatic ties began to unravel. Back on U.S. soil, the streets filled with millions of protesters. From New York City to Los Angeles, from Atlanta to Portland, Americans poured out of their homes chanting, "Genocide out, justice now." Placards showing pictures of African leaders alongside the word "targeted" were held high. In Washington, hundreds of thousands camped outside the Capitol demanding Trump's immediate arrest. Even lifelong Trump supporters were stunned into silence or outright disavowal. One man, wrapped in a faded MAGA flag, wept as he told a reporter, "This is about more than politics. It's about basic human decency. I didn't vote for genocide." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, IBRAHIM Traoré watched the chaos unfold from Ouagadougou. "Trump dug his own grave," he said calmly during a press briefing. "He underestimated African intelligence and overestimated America's ability to hide its hatred." His words were met with applause and admiration around the world. 3. Days after the damning broadcast, Donald Trump was politically radioactive. His cabinet had fully resigned in disgrace. Congress, with overwhelming bipartisan support, had moved to impeach him for a second time, this time with evidence of international war crimes. The U.S. military, often accused of turning a blind eye to civilian leadership, issued a historic public statement. We do not serve genocide. We are sworn to defend the Constitution, not white supremacy. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff went on national television to say that the military would refuse to carry out any orders from Trump until he was legally removed from power. Inside the White House, Trump had barricaded himself in the Oval Office with a shrinking circle of loyalists. Paranoid, emotionally unstable, and spiraling into delusion, he paced back and forth, muttering the same words over and over. Ibrahim destroyed me. How did this African boy do this? Steve. Bannon, pale and desperate, attempted one last-ditch strategy. Sir, maybe we say you were drugged, he suggested. Trump's lawyer, visibly shaken and preparing his own resignation letter, shook his head. It's over. You confessed to planned genocide on national television. No one will believe anything else now. While Trump unraveled, IBRAHIM TRAORÉ was being hailed as a global hero. The president of France called him personally. President Traoré, he said with emotion, you saved millions of lives by exposing these monstrous plans. Europe will never forget your courage. Pope Francis released a rare papal statement. President Traoré has shown the world what true moral courage looks like. He defended not just a continent, but the shared humanity of us all. Universities across Europe and Africa began offering him honorary doctorates. Human rights organizations pushed for him to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't just defend Africa, said one committee member. He defended civilization from falling into darkness. When the U.S. Senate held the final impeachment vote, the result was unanimous, 100-0. His crimes are indefensible, said the Republican Senate Majority Leader. This is no longer about party. This is about the soul of our nation. Treason, genocide, conspiracy against humanity. These cannot be ignored. Trump attempted to make one final televised address to explain himself, but every major news network refused to air it. We will not give a platform to an avowed white supremacist who confessed to genocide, CNN's president stated. The time for giving him a microphone is over. The time for justice has begun. When federal marshals arrived at the White House carrying an arrest warrant for war crimes, Trump sat slouched behind the resolute desk, muttering incoherently, Ibrahim, how did he know everything? The answer, as history would later record, was painfully simple. Trump had underestimated his adversary and played checkers while Ibrahim played chess. While Trump plotted war, Ibrahim prepared to expose him. 6 months later, the former U.S. president sat alone in the dock at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. He faced formal charges: conspiracy to commit genocide, crimes against humanity, attempted political assassinations, and abuse of executive power. Ibrahim Traoré, now a global symbol of resistance and truth, stood before the judges as the prosecution's star witness. Your Honors, he said with quiet dignity, I present to you the evidence of a plan to wipe out the leadership of an entire continent, to suppress our voices, eliminate our freedom, and recolonize Africa under the banner of supremacy. But that plan failed, because truth found its voice. The courtroom was heavy with tension as Ibrahim Traoré stood before the panel of judges at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of history as he presented evidence of a coordinated and systematic campaign, a plan, meticulously crafted to dismantle and eliminate independent African leadership and subject the continent once more to external domination through violence, manipulation, and terror. This wasn't just political sabotage. It was a genocidal operation in the modern age. The prosecution unveiled an avalanche of damning evidence. Covert recordings of meetings where African presidents were discussed like targets on a military map, signed executive orders authorizing covert killings, classified CIA memos, and even detailed financial records, bank transfers worth billions, earmarked for Operation Free Africa, a dark and sinister campaign to assassinate 47 African leaders within an 18-month window. The documents showed it was not merely theoretical. Plans were in motion. Names were circled, flights booked, contractors hired. U.S. military whistleblowers, visibly shaken on the stand, testified about being approached for operations that violated every law of war and humanity. One general, breaking down in tears, described reading a briefing that listed democratically elected African leaders under the title High-Value Elimination Targets. This was no rogue faction. It had the presidential seal of approval. When confronted with this mountain of evidence, the prosecution declared, "Rarely in modern history has there been such indisputable proof of genocidal men's RIA, the criminal, intent to destroy, to erase, to dominate." Donald Trump, now a fallen emperor of hate, sat stone-faced beside his defense attorney. His legal team made one desperate argument, that he had been under extreme emotional distress, that his decisions were clouded by temporary insanity. But the chief judge quickly cut through this claim. Stress does not explain a multi-year conspiracy involving dozens of departments, billions of dollars, and international reach. This was no impulse. It was a blueprint for genocide. The defense had no response. As the trial progressed, the world heard horrifying details. Trump had greenlit a $2 billion fund to initiate and execute Operation Free Africa. His targets weren't enemies in war zones. They were presidents elected by their people, activists fighting for human rights, academics raising a new generation of thinkers. Former CIA officials confirmed under oath this wasn't counterterrorism. It was a planned erasure of Africa's intellectual and political elite. Ibrahim's own testimony shook the chamber. To learn that the most powerful man in the world not only wanted me dead, he said, but viewed the entire continent as subhuman. It's a pain I can't describe. It wasn't just about me. It was about every African child, every mother, every dream. After weeks of harrowing evidence, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Crimes against humanity. Conspiracy to commit genocide. Abuse of executive power for racial extermination. The judge, in a voice firm with moral clarity, declared at sentencing, "This man displayed a total and callous disregard for human life and dignity. His actions represent a terrifying revival of a mindset the world vowed to destroy after the Holocaust. Today, we fulfill that vow." As Trump was led away in handcuffs, shackled and silent, crowds outside the court erupted in cheers. In Washington, jubilant protesters marched with signs that read, "Justice delivered and genocide belongs in chains." Across Africa, Ibrahim Traoré was hailed as a liberator, a guardian of an entire civilization. The African Union's chairman, during a historic broadcast, said, "He protected us from a modern Holocaust. We will never forget." In the 2 years that followed this historic trial, the world underwent seismic change. The United States, under new leadership and humbled by global outrage, formally apologized to the African Union and committed $50 billion in reparations to help heal the wounds of the attempted genocide. The gesture, while historic, was only part of the global reckoning. Ibrahim stood before the United Nations General Assembly, now President of the African Union, addressing a special session on genocide prevention. His words echoed through the halls of diplomacy and power. 2 years ago, we exposed the machinery of death aimed at our people. Today, we remind the world, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Thunderous applause erupted, followed by a rare standing ovation from all 193 member states. He continued, uncompromising and eloquent. Trump did not just plan mass murder. He represented a colonial arrogance that still haunts the corridors of global power. He believed Africa existed to serve Western interests, that Africans were disposable. His downfall proves this era is over. The age of impunity has ended. From this day forward, no leader, no matter how powerful, shall escape justice if they plot to annihilate others. The United Nations ratified the Traoré Protocol, a global framework for monitoring and intercepting state-sponsored genocide before it begins. For the first time in human history, there was a proactive system to prevent extermination. Africa, meanwhile, had entered a renaissance. Under unified leadership, the continent's economy surged by 15% annually. Healthcare systems improved. Literacy soared, and technology hubs blossomed from Nairobi to Lagos. Economists dubbed the phenomenon the Traoré effect. It was more than prosperity. It was the birth of a new Africa, confident, united, and never again to be dominated. In a maximum security prison cell in The Hague, Donald Trump sat alone, pacing like a caged ghost. He still muttered to himself, "How did he know? How did he do it?" The guards had no answers, but history did. The answer was simple. IBRAHIM Traoré had prepared for war. He had studied his enemy's weaknesses. He had understood the nature of hatred and responded with strategy, intelligence, and unity. Trump, in contrast, had underestimated his adversary. Blinded by racial arrogance, he never imagined that an African leader could outthink, outmaneuver, and expose him to the entire world. History would remember IBRAHIM Traoré not just as a survivor or a hero, but as a man who saved a continent, who exposed the genocidal heart of a modern empire, and proved that dignity, intelligence, and courage can shatter even the most powerful machinery of hate. His legacy would endure for generations, a living monument to the unbreakable spirit of Africa.